The sky over Germany on February 1st, 1943 was a frozen hell. At 25,000 feet, the air temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Inside the cramped cockpit of a B-17 flying fortress, Second Lieutenant John C. Morgan gripped the control yoke with hands that had long since lost all feeling. Ice crystals formed on his oxygen mask. His breath came in short, painful gasps. But the cold wasn't what terrified him. It was what he saw through the shattered plexiglass ahead. His co-pilot sat motionless in the right seat, blood frozen across his face. The entire nose section of their bomber had been torn away by German flak. Through the gaping hole where the bombardier's station used to be, Morgan could see straight through to empty sky. The navigator was gone. The bombardier was gone. Half the aircraft had simply ceased to exist. And yet, impossibly, they were still flying. This is the story of a mission that should have ended in catastrophe, of a pilot who refused to give up when every rational instinct screamed at him to bail out, and of a crew that discovered the true meaning of brotherhood at the edge of death itself. The mission had begun like so many others. January 1943 marked a crucial turning point in the air war over Europe. The United States 8th Air Force, based in England, had committed itself to a brutal strategy: daylight precision bombing of Nazi Germany's industrial heart. Unlike the British, who bombed at night, American doctrine demanded flying in broad daylight, in tight formations, through walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of German fighters. The theory was simple. The B-17 flying fortress, a bristling with 13 50 caliber machine guns, could defend itself. In formation, dozens of bombers would create an impenetrable curtain of defensive fire. The reality was far bloodier. By early 1943, bomber crews faced a statistical nightmare. The average life expectancy of an 8th Air Force airman was 15 missions. To complete a full tour of duty required 25. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Most men would not survive. Second Lieutenant John Morgan knew these odds. At 26 years old, he was older than most of the kids flying these missions. He'd been a school teacher before the war, a quiet man from Texas who never imagined he'd find himself 4 miles above enemy territory, responsible for 9 other lives. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Richard Dunphy, was younger, eager, or still possessed of the invincible optimism that characterized so many American flyers in those early days. Their B-17, tail number 42-29648, carried no nickname. Some crews painted elaborate nose art on their aircraft, gave them names like Memphis Belle or Hell's Angels. Morgan's bomber remained anonymous, just another drab olive machine in the assembly line of war. Perhaps that was fitting. What happened that day would require no embellishment. The target was the submarine pens at Wilhelmshaven on Germany's North Sea coast. These massive concrete bunkers protected the U-boats that were strangling Britain's Atlantic lifeline. Destroying them had become an obsession for Allied planners. On paper, it was a straightforward mission. In practice, it meant flying deep into German airspace, through some of the most heavily defended territory in the world. The formation took off from bases across eastern England in the pre-dawn darkness. 64 B-17 assembled in the frozen sky, each one carrying 4,000 pounds of high explosive bombs and 10 terrified young men. Morgan's bomber took its position in the formation, engines roaring, wingtips just yards from the aircraft on either side. This proximity was essential. Break formation, fall behind, and you were dead. German fighter pilots called isolated bombers stragglers. They hunted them with the patience of wolves separating wounded prey from the herd. The first hours passed without incident. The formation thundered east across the North Sea, a steel cloud casting shadows on the grey water below. Inside the bombers, men sat at their positions in silence. The waist gunners stood at their open windows, 50-caliber machine guns pointed outward, scanning the sky for the first sign of German fighters. The ball turret gunner hung suspended beneath the aircraft in his cramped glass sphere, the most vulnerable and isolated position on the plane. The tail gunner crouched alone in the rear, separated from the rest of the crew, watching their 6 o'clock. In the cockpit, Morgan and Dunphy went through their checks mechanically. Airspeed, altitude, engine temperatures, fuel consumption, the routine of staying alive. Neither man spoke much. There was nothing to say. They'd done this before. They would do it again, assuming they survived the day. The German coast appeared as a dark line on the horizon. Almost immediately, the flak began. Anti-aircraft artillery, or flak. This was the invisible killer of the air war. German 88mm guns could fire shells to 30,000 feet. Each shell contained a timed fuse, set to explode at a predetermined altitude. When it detonated, it threw chunks of jagged steel in every direction. A bomber flying through flak had to maintain strict formation, flying straight and level, making no evasive maneuvers. This made them perfect targets. Pilots could only grip their controls and pray. The first bursts appeared as black puffs of smoke, blossoming in the formation like deadly flowers. Morgan felt the concussions through the control yoke. The bomber shuddered. Fragments of shrapnel pinged against the aluminum skin. In the back of the aircraft, men hunched over their guns, trying to make themselves smaller, knowing it was futile. Either the shrapnel hit you, or it didn't. There was no skill involved, no way to fight back. You simply endured. The formation pressed on. Bombers began to fall. To Morgan's left, a B-17 took a direct hit in the No. 3 engine. Fire erupted along the wing. The pilot fought for control, but physics was merciless. The burning engine tore free, and the bomber rolled inverted, spinning toward the earth. Morgan saw parachutes, small white flowers against the dark ground. 3, perhaps 4. The rest of the crew never made it out. To his right, another bomber simply exploded. One moment it was there, holding position. The next, it was a ball of orange flame and tumbling debris. No parachutes. 10 men gone in an instant, atomized so completely that their families would never even have graves to visit. This was the nature of the air war. Death was random, instantaneous, and overwhelming. You watched your friends die and kept flying because there was nothing else to do. The target appeared ahead, the massive concrete submarine pens visible even from 25,000 feet. The bombardier in the lead aircraft would control the bomb release for the entire formation. Every bomber would drop on his signal, salvo after salvo of high explosive intended to overwhelm the German defenses through sheer volume. The flak intensified. The Germans knew exactly where the bombers had to fly. They'd zeroed their guns on the approach path. The sky turned black with explosions. The bomber bucked and heaved. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. In the radio room, the operator slumped over his equipment, a piece of steel the size of a quarter lodged in his chest. He died without making a sound, and then, in an instant of catastrophic violence, everything changed. The shell struck just below the cockpit, slightly forward and to the left. The explosion was deafening, overwhelming, absolute. The entire nose section of the bomber disintegrated. The bombardier's compartment, the navigator's station, the forward gun position, all of it simply ceased to exist. The two men stationed there vanished into the slipstream, whether killed instantly by the blast or swept away into the void, no one would ever know. The concussion waves slammed through the cockpit. The plexiglass windscreen shattered. Metal fragments tore into Second Lieutenant Dunphy's face and head. Blood sprayed across the instrument panel. He jerked violently in his seat and went still. Morgan felt the aircraft lurch sideways. The control yoke tried to tear itself from his hands. The B-17, suddenly missing tons of weight from its forward section, pitched upward, threatening to stall. Morgan shoved the yoke forward, fighting to keep the nose down, fighting to maintain airspeed. Cold air screamed through the destroyed cockpit. Papers, maps, anything not secured, whirled away into nothing. Through the hole where the nose used to be, Morgan could see the ground impossibly far below. The bomber was now essentially an open tube, a metal cylinder with the front end torn away. The aerodynamics were all wrong. Every instinct, every hour of training told Morgan that this aircraft could not fly. But it was flying. Somehow, impossibly, the four Wright Cyclone engines kept turning. The wings kept generating lift. The bomber was mortally wounded, but not yet dead. Morgan's mind raced through his options. The rational choice was obvious. Bail out, ring the alarm bell, give the crew the order to abandon aircraft, and jump. They were over enemy territory, yes, but at least they'd be alive. Prisoner of war camps were brutal, but you could survive them. You couldn't survive a 25,000-foot fall in a disintegrating aircraft. But even as he thought this, Morgan realized the problem. He looked to his right. Dunphy still sat in the co-pilot seat, upright, held in place by his harness. Blood covered his face. His eyes were closed. But Morgan could see his chest moving. Shallow breaths. Dunphy was alive. Unconscious but alive. And if Morgan left the controls, even for the few seconds it would take to reach over and shake Dunphy awake, the bomber would enter an uncontrollable spin. The aircraft was balanced on a knife's edge, or stable only because Morgan held the yoke in exactly the right position, applying exactly the right pressure. Let go, and they'd tumble from the sky. Morgan made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He couldn't leave Dunphy. He wouldn't leave Dunphy. If he bailed out, his co-pilot would die alone in this shattered wreck. That was unacceptable. He would fly the bomber back to England, alone, with the nose blown off, with half his crew dead or wounded. He would fly it home or die trying. Through the intercom, Morgan's voice crackled to the remaining crew members. "We're staying with her. Check for wounded. Anyone who needs to bail out, do it now. Everyone else, we're going home." In the waist section, the gunners looked at each other in disbelief. They could see the damage. They could see the massive hole where the nose used to be. The navigator's desk, the bombardier's station, the Norden bomb site that cost more than the entire aircraft, all gone. Through the opening, freezing wind tore through the fuselage at 200 miles per hour. The temperature inside the aircraft plunged, but not one man moved toward the escape hatch. If their pilot was staying, they were staying. It was that simple. The formation had completed its bomb run and was turning for home. Morgan fought to keep position. The B-17's damaged aerodynamics made it want to slip sideways, to fall behind. German fighters prowled the edges of the formation like sharks, looking for exactly this kind of wounded prey. Morgan couldn't let them fall back. He pushed the throttles forward, coaxing more power from the engines, ignoring the warning lights that flickered across the instrument panel. The flight engineer climbed up from the waist section, pulled himself into the cockpit, and froze. The wind, the noise, the blood, the gaping void where the front of the aircraft should be. It was overwhelming. He looked at Morgan, looked at the unconscious Dunphy, and understood the situation immediately. "What do you need?" he shouted over the wind. "Help with Dunphy," Morgan called back, "and monitor the engines. We're going to need every ounce of power." The engineer nodded. He checked Dunphy's pulse, bandaged the worst of the head wounds as best he could in the chaos. The co-pilot's eyes flickered but didn't open. Severe concussion at minimum, possibly a fractured skull. He needed a hospital, and he needed it soon. The flight engineer then turned to the engine instruments. Oil pressure on number 2 was dropping, temperature rising. They'd taken damage there too, shrapnel probably, though it was hard to tell. The engine was slowly bleeding to death. "Number 2 won't make it," the engineer reported. Morgan nodded grimly. "We'll run it until it quits." They crossed back over the German coast, heading west. The flak continued, but lighter now. The formation was leaving the heavily defended areas, racing for the relative safety of the North Sea. Behind them, more bombers fell. An aircraft with 2 engines on fire broke formation, descending in a shallow glide, trying to make it to the water before the flames reached the fuel tanks. Another bomber, its tail section shattered by a direct flak hit, simply folded in the middle and tumbled from the sky like a broken toy. Morgan kept his eyes forward, kept his hands on the yoke. The wind through the open nose was a constant, a screaming presence. Ice formed on every surface. His face had gone numb hours ago. He could barely feel his fingers. But he didn't dare put on gloves, didn't dare compromise his grip on the controls, even for a second. The North Sea appeared below, grey and endless. They were over water now, away from the flak. But they were far from safe. The crippled bomber was losing altitude, sinking slowly but inevitably toward the waves. Number 2 engine was smoking heavily, the propeller windmilling. Morgan shut it down, feathered the prop, and adjusted trim to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. 3 engines, a gaping hole in the nose, fuel gauges dropping toward empty, and still over 100 miles from the English coast. The flight engineer did the calculations in his head and didn't like the answer. "We might not make it to the coast," he said quietly. Morgan didn't respond. He'd already done the same math. The bomber was too damaged, too draggy, burning too much fuel. The numbers didn't work, but numbers had never stopped him before. He adjusted the mixture, leaned out the engines to burn less fuel. He experimented with altitude, finding the height where the bomber flew most efficiently. He trimmed and retrimmed, searching for every possible advantage. Every decision was a gamble. Fly too slow and they'd stall. Too fast and they'd burn precious fuel. Too high and the engines would starve for oxygen. Too low and they'd never make it over the English cliffs. The remaining crew members sat in silence. There was nothing for them to do now except wait. The ball turret gunner had climbed out of his sphere, unwilling to remain trapped in that glass coffin if they went into the sea. The tail gunner had moved forward, wanting to be with the others. They huddled together against the cold, watching their pilot fight to save them. Minutes stretched into hours. The bomber droned on, engines laboring, gradually descending. 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. The waves below grew closer, individual white caps visible now. Morgan knew that ditching a B-17 in the North Sea was nearly impossible. The weight of the engines would drive the nose straight down. The aircraft would sink in seconds. In water this cold, a man had perhaps 2 minutes before hypothermia claimed him. He refused to consider it. The English coast was ahead. It had to be ahead. They'd come too far to die now. And then, impossibly, miraculously, to land appeared on the horizon, the chalk cliffs of England white against the grey sea, the most beautiful sight Morgan had ever seen. But they were still too low. The bomber was barely maintaining altitude. If they tried to climb over the cliffs, the engines would fail. If they didn't climb, they'd fly straight into the rock face. Morgan made his final gamble. He pushed the throttles to maximum power, every engine screaming. The bomber shuddered, clawed at the air, began to rise. Slowly, so slowly. The cliffs rushed toward them. The crew braced for impact. The bomber cleared the cliff edge with perhaps 50 feet to spare. The first RAF airfield appeared ahead. Morgan didn't have time to be choosy. He dropped the landing gear, praying it hadn't been damaged, praying the hydraulics still worked. The wheels locked down. He lowered flaps. The bomber slowed, sinking toward the runway. He had one chance. The aircraft was too damaged for a go-around. If he missed this landing, they were dead. The runway rushed up. Morgan held the nose high, bleeding off speed. The main wheels touched down. The bomber bounced, settled, rolled. Morgan stood on the brakes. The shattered bomber screamed down the runway, finally mercifully rolling to a stop. For a long moment, no one moved. They'd made it. Against every law of physics and probability, they'd made it. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft, medics scrambling aboard. They carried Dunphy out on a stretcher. He would survive, though he'd never fly again. The bodies of the bombardier and navigator were never found, lost somewhere over Germany. Morgan finally released the control yoke. His hands wouldn't straighten, as the muscles had locked in position after nearly 4 hours of continuous strain. Medics had to pry his fingers loose, one at a time. When he finally climbed down from the wreck and saw the full extent of the damage, even he couldn't believe they'd survived. The entire nose section gone. Hundreds of shrapnel holes throughout the fuselage. Number 2 engine destroyed. Hydraulic lines severed. It looked less like an aircraft and more like the carcass of some great mechanical beast. "How did you fly this thing?" an engineering officer asked in amazement. Morgan just shook his head. He didn't have an answer. He'd simply done what needed to be done. The story of the B-17 that landed with half its plane missing spread quickly through the 8th Air Force. It became a legend, the proof that these machines could absorb incredible punishment and still bring their crews home. More importantly, it became proof that the men flying them possessed a kind of courage that transcended rational thought. John Morgan was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. The citation praised his intrepidity and determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. But Morgan never felt like a hero. He'd simply refused to abandon his co-pilot. Any pilot would have done the same, he insisted. That's what brothers in arms did for each other. In the months that followed, thousands more missions were flown. Thousands more bombers were lost. The air war over Europe ground on with industrial brutality, in a war of attrition where courage and sacrifice were measured in tons of bombs dropped and lists of the dead that grew longer every day. But on one February morning in 1943, one pilot in one shattered bomber proved something essential about the human spirit. That determination could overcome physics. That loyalty could conquer fear. That sometimes, just sometimes, refusing to accept the impossible made the impossible real. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its legendary status through missions like this one. But it wasn't the aircraft that was truly legendary. It was the men who flew them, ordinary people who did extraordinary things simply because it was their duty, because their brothers depended on them, because giving up was never an option. John Morgan returned to combat operations. He flew more missions, faced more flak. He watched more friends die. He survived the war and went home to Texas, back to teaching, back to a quiet life that bore no resemblance to those hours in the frozen sky over Germany. He rarely spoke about what happened that day. When asked, he'd simply say he did his job, nothing more. But those who flew with him, those who understood what it meant to keep flying when every instinct screamed to bail out, they knew the truth. They knew they'd witnessed something rare and precious. A man who looked death in the face and refused to blink, who valued another's life above his own, who found within himself reserves of strength he didn't know existed until the moment demanded them. The bomber he brought home that day was too damaged to repair. It was stripped for parts and scrapped, its aluminum recycled into other aircraft, its story preserved only in mission reports and fading memories. But what it represented endured. The willingness to sacrifice, the refusal to leave a comrade behind, the stubborn, determined courage of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. This is what won the war. Not just the machines, not just the bombs, but the spirit of men like John Morgan, men who understood that some things matter more than survival, that honor and loyalty and brotherhood transcend self-preservation, that the measure of a man isn't found in comfort and safety, but in how he responds when everything is falling apart around him. On that frozen morning in February 1943, with half his aircraft missing and death seeming inevitable, John Morgan made a choice: to stay, to fight, to bring his crew home or die trying. And in making that choice, he joined the ranks of heroes, ordinary men who accomplish the extraordinary, who remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. The sky over Germany claimed many brave men that day, as it would claim many more before the war ended. But it couldn't claim John Morgan, not while he still had breath in his lungs and strength in his arms. Not while his co-pilot still needed him. Not while there was still a chance, however slim, to bring his brothers home. He landed that broken bomber not because it was possible, but because it was necessary, and in doing so, he showed us all what the human spirit is truly capable of when pushed beyond its limits. That is the legacy of the B-17 pilot who landed with half his plane missing. Not just a story of survival, but a testament to the unbreakable bonds forged in combat, the courage found in desperate moments, and the truth that sometimes heroes are simply ordinary people who refuse to give up when giving up would be so much easier. The war is long over. The men who fought it are nearly all gone now, but their stories remain, reminders of a time when the fate of the world hung in the balance and ordinary people rose to meet extraordinary challenges. Stories of sacrifice and courage, of fear overcome and duty fulfilled. Stories like John Morgan's remind us why we remember, why we honor, why we can never forget what they did, what they endured, what they gave so that others might live in freedom. Half a plane, 400 miles, one pilot who refused to quit. That's all it took to create a legend that will endure as long as people value courage. Honor brotherhood, and understand that the greatest victories are often won not on battlefields, but in the hearts of men who simply refuse to surrender.